How are you? Great to be learning with you on a Tuesday. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Tuesday? Yom Shlishi. Yehudit in South Carolina, Stephen in New Hampshire, Sharon in New Jersey, Bill in mid-Missouri, Bella in Florida, Shandor in the Bronx, Joe in the Inland Empire, Joseph in Massachusetts, Paul in the Great Northwest, Melissa in Great Neck. We're here despite Facebook downtime. Or was Facebook down today? It seems to be working. Don't make me nervous. Excuse me, Rebecca in Shreveport, Louisiana. Welcome. Guy in Ohio, Lucy in Minnesota, Karen in Northern California, Tom in PA, Ella saying shalom, Marjorie in Georgia, Chaim in Florida. Welcome, everybody. Our daf is page Vav, daf Vav, page 6 here in Tractate Bava Metzia, the 22nd volume of the Talmud. We're picking this up near the bottom of 5b. We're just going to read the last couple of lines that we covered yesterday to give us a start. And generally, we're talking about situations where, the classic case, like it says in the Torah, that somebody admits to part of a claim that's been made about him and denies the rest. So he pays what he admits, and he's forced to take an oath saying, and I swear, right? Bli neder, he says, I swear that I do not owe the rest of that. And then he's excused from that liability. And this occurs in the absence of real evidence, right? If they had the testimony of two witnesses, we would have established the matter, and we wouldn't have need for this oath. Toward the end of yesterday, we're talking about, well, if somebody becomes a suspect to financial misdealing, he's suspect of being a robber, he's suspect of misappropriating a deposit that was entrusted to him, then why are we going to trust him to swear an oath that he would be, God-fearing enough to take the oath seriously? If indeed he would rob, perhaps he would also lie about taking an oath, and so should we or should we not trust him? So, in an ordinary case, one who denies receiving a deposit is not disqualified from testifying. The fact that he denies that he received a deposit, even if it's proven that this was false, does not necessarily mean that he's a dishonest person who we should not accept his oath or his testimony as a witness in a different case. Why? When we say that one who denies receiving a deposit is disqualified from bearing witness, it is in a case where there are witnesses who come and they testified against him at that time when he denied the owner's claim in court that the deposit was in fact in his house and he knew that it was there, right? So in other words, he could have been making a mistake. If we bring witnesses that can show that he's positively, demonstrably lying as opposed to making a mistake, well, then we might disqualify him, or we would disqualify him from being, giving witness testimony in other cases, or swearing an oath would follow. But only if the witness is established not only that he was wrong, but that he knew he was lying when he said that he never received the deposit. Alternatively, where we would disqualify him from being a witness, it is with regard to a case where he was holding the item in his hand and denying that he received the deposit. So in those circumstances, it is obvious that he was not buying time, but rather that he intended to keep the item. He was consciously stealing the item, and that's why we would disqualify him. And the Gemara asks, but if one who is suspended of financial dishonesty cannot be forced to take an oath, then that which Rav Huna says with regard to the laws of bailees, right? And we saw there are four kinds of bailees: the unpaid bailee, the paid bailee, the borrower, and the renter. That which Rav Huna says with regard to the laws of bailees is difficult. As Rav Huna says that if a bailee does not return the deposit, claiming that it was lost or stolen, and says that he is prepared to pay for it, the judges nevertheless administer an oath to him that the item is not in his possession. And let us say that since he is suspected of financial dishonesty, he is suspect with regard to taking an oath as well. Now see, this is a situation where he's willing to pay, but that doesn't mean he's an honest person, right? If I deposit, let's say that Reuven has had his eye, my neighbor Reuven has had his eye on my leather jacket for a long time. He's always asking me, can I buy it from you, and I say, no, it's my favorite leather jacket, no. So then I'm going out of town for a trip. I decide to be nice. I'll let Reuven use my leather jacket while I'm away, right? And he's going to take care of it for me, okay? And he's happy to do that as an unpaid bailee. I come back. And I say, okay, give me the jacket back. He says, you know what? I was negligent. It's gone. Here, I'll pay you for it. Now, I want my favorite leather jacket. So I might be suspicious that Reuven is claiming, that he was negligent, or let's say I asked him to watch, or let's say he's a borrower. We could say that he's a borrower because he wanted to borrow it. He agreed to borrow it. And now when I want it back, he's not giving it. So he has a higher level of responsibility for it. And he says, yeah, it was lost. It was in my care. I lost it. It was taken. It was stolen. Whatever. I'll pay you for it. But I don't want it to be paid for it. I want my jacket back, right? So even though he gives me the money for it, that's not what I want. And he might be misappropriating it even though he's paying for it. And if we can prove that that's what he's doing, then he's being dishonest. And why should we accept him swearing an oath that he didn't lose it, right? So the Gemara answers, there too, the bailee is not suspected of outright robbery, as even if he took the deposited item for himself, he could rationalize in his head his behavior, saying to himself, well, since I gave him money for the item, I did nothing wrong. Therefore, his oath is deemed credible, and an oath can be administered to him, right? It is dishonest. He's not allowed to do that. But we haven't proven that even though he would misappropriate the jacket, that proves he's a dishonest person, because he might misunderstand the law. He might think to himself, well, I'm paying Sal for it. He put it in my care. Okay, it could have got lost. I'm paying for it. That doesn't mean he's the sort of person that would swear a false oath, which is a much higher, greater degree of dishonesty. Now, Rav Acha of Difti said to Ravina, but by paying for the deposit instead of returning it, doesn't the bailee, in this case Reuven, violate the prohibition of, you know what prohibition it is? It's the 10th commandment. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his slave, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything that is your neighbor's, right? It's my jacket. He likes the jacket. He wants the jacket. He's definitely coveting it, right? And now he's taking advantage of the situation where it was entrusted to him to get it for himself. He's certainly willing to pay for it. He's not trying to steal it, but he is taking something that is not his, demonstrably so. He covets it, right? He definitely covets it. That's why he takes it. Now, so he's violating the 10th commandment. And when you say that, well, violating the 10th commandment by having a feeling, that's something we should aspire not to do, but why are there going to be consequences for having a feeling? It's hard to control that. No, because now it's an action. This is the active form of coveting. So you take it, something that was not going to be given to you, you're willing to pay, but it was never going to be given to you, was never going to be sold to you. He took it anyway. That's active coveting. Now the Gemara answers that the prohibition, you shall not covet, and therefore, since he's violating do not covet, maybe we shouldn't trust him to swear an oath about it either. And so the Gemara answers the prohibition, you shall not covet, is understood by most people as referring to taking an item without paying money. Active coveting is stealing it. Since the bailee may have been unaware that he was acting criminally even when he pays for it, because he didn't have a right to do that, his testimony and his oath are still deemed credible. He in his mind doesn't realize how dishonest he's being, so that doesn't mean that we can infer from his action of taking my jacket and paying me for it, even though it's against my will. We can't infer from that he would also swear a false oath. And so if he swears that that's what happened, right, that it was stolen from him or it was lost, and that's why he's paying me for it, then we would accept his oath to that effect. And furthermore, we are on 6a now. I'm sorry. Now we're on 6a. And the Gemara asks, but if one who is suspected of theft cannot be administered an oath, then that which Rav Nachman says, that when a person denies a debt entirely, the judges administer an oath of inducement to him. This is difficult, right? So we saw that yesterday. The oath of inducement, this is not where there's a partial admission to a claim by the plaintiff and a partial denial, and so he pays what he admits, and then he takes an oath as to the rest. Rather, I bring a claim against him. He says, I deposited my jacket with you. He says, no, I never received the jacket, right? And so at that point, by Torah law, if I can't bring witnesses that I deposited there and he fully denies it, I'm out of luck, right? I'm done. There's nothing to be said. But by rabbinic ordinance in that situation, and there has to be at least some meat on the bone, right? I can't just willy-nilly make a claim against anyone and then make him swear an oath. But for whatever reason, this is, there's enough meat on this bone that even though he admits to nothing, since the litigation was brought to the rabbinic court, they will make him take an oath, not by Torah law, but by rabbinic ordinance, that he never received the item. That's called the oath of inducement. Just so that people can't deny anything, and then get away with it. But now this idea of making him swear the oath of inducement is going to be problematic in light of what we just said. Let us say that since he is suspect with regard to financial dishonesty, right, that he might be willing, well, now he's not paying. Right? He denies that he ever received it. So this is something else. But let's say that if for whatever reason he's suspect with regard to financial dishonesty, then he is suspect with regard to taking an oath. And furthermore, that which Rabbi Chia teaches in a Baraisa with regard to the case of the storekeeper and the laborer, right, where the employer said to his laborer, instead of getting salary from me, I have an arrangement with that storekeeper. Just go and get lunch from him, and that was going to have the same value as what I would have paid you for your work. And then later, the laborer says, I never received the lunch from the storekeeper, and the storekeeper says, I gave him the lunch, so now pay me for the lunch that I gave him. Right, and the employer, and they both are going to swear an oath about that, and then the employer is going to have to give the laborer his salary because he claims he never got the food, and he's going to have to pay for the food because the storekeeper says he gave the food to the laborer. So that was that case. So furthermore, that which Rabbi Chia teaches in a Baraisa with regard to the case of the storekeeper and the laborer, that both parties take an oath and take payment from the employer, this is also difficult. Let us say there too, that since he is suspect with regard to financial dishonesty, he is suspect with regard to taking an oath. In other words, if we have reason to believe that the one who fully denies the claim is being dishonest, or here in the case of the storekeeper and the laborer, one of them is definitely being dishonest, we just don't know which, and we're going to make them both swear an oath. So how can we do that if somebody who is willing to steal, if we're going to distrust him when he takes an oath? And the answer is going to be somebody who's willing to steal is not necessarily somebody who'd be willing to swear a false oath. Right? Where am I? And furthermore, right, another example of this, and furthermore, with regard to that which Rav Sheshes says, the judges administer 3 oaths to an unpaid bailee who claims that the deposit with which he was entrusted was stolen from him. Right? An unpaid bailee is going to be exempt from liability if it was stolen from him because he didn't agree to prevent theft. A paid bailee agrees to prevent theft. An unpaid bailee doesn't. So if it was stolen from him, he's off the hook. But when he says, I am exempt from liability because it was stolen from me, he's going to have to swear an oath. And once he's swearing an oath, says Rav Sheshes, he actually has to swear 3 oaths. And what are the oaths? He has to say, I hereby take an oath that I was not negligent, criminally negligent, in safeguarding the object. I hereby take an oath that I did not misappropriate the object for myself. And I hereby take an oath that it is no longer in my possession. So again, we would have the same difficulty. Since the court raises these suspicions against the bailee that perhaps he did take it, then let us say that since he is suspected of financial dishonesty, he is suspected with regard to taking an oath. So how can the court administer these oaths? If indeed the guy did misappropriate, then isn't he also the sort of guy who would swear a false oath? So rather, the conclusion from all of these examples where we do administer the oaths, even though the person might be guilty of some kind of financial dishonesty, is that we do not say that since one is suspected of financial dishonesty, he is suspected with regard to taking an oath, right? We do not say that. It is possible to be suspected of financial dishonesty, but not suspected of being somebody who would swear a false oath. And Abaye said, there is no proof from the 3 laws cited above that an oath is administered to one who is suspect with regard to financial dishonesty. As it can be explained that the reason the oath is administered in these cases is that we suspect that perhaps new circumstances being added to the situation. We suspect that perhaps the defendant has an old loan that he lent to the plaintiff, and he has been unable to get his money back. And he is therefore withholding or claiming ownership of the item or the money that the plaintiff is claiming was deposited with the defendant. The defendant is actually holding it as repayment of that old loan, not because he is outright misappropriating it or robbing it, right? So that might be in his mental, what he's thinking, what the defendant is thinking is, well, I didn't take your jacket because I coveted your jacket and I want your jacket for myself. I took your jacket, Sal, because last year Reuven lent me $100 and I never paid it back. So now he's keeping the jacket, making a claim on it to make good the money I never repaid him last year. So if that were the circumstance, there is no suspicion of financial dishonesty, at least not in his thinking. He had no intention to do something dishonest. He was just trying to make good on the loan that had never been repaid to him. And that's why we would accept that he swears an oath that when the jacket went missing, if he says that the jacket went missing, we might still believe him, right? In other words, these can be contradictory claims if he says he didn't take it. But in a case where there's partial, especially, and we're going to make him swear an oath about the rest, again, it might be that what he took to satisfy an old debt, and then what he's swearing an oath about, the rest that was stolen, we have no reason to suspect that he would swear a false oath because we have no reason to suspect that he, at least in his mind, was being financially dishonest. So the Gemara asks, if so, right, if it is the way you're saying, Abaye, why does he take an oath in any of these cases? Let him take the item or the money without taking an oath, as perhaps he is withholding it as repayment for an old loan, in which case the oath will not determine the truth in the dispute at hand. So rather, Abaye's suggestion should be understood differently. We suspect that perhaps the defendant is uncertain as to whether he has an old loan or not that the plaintiff owes him. And the defendant is unsure whether the plaintiff owes him money, and he is withholding the item just in case. So the Gemara asks, but then why don't we say in this case that if the defendant is capable of seizing another person's property due to an uncertain debt, that he may also take an oath falsely due to that same uncertainty? How can we administer an oath to him? And Rav Sheshes, the son of Rav Edi, said, People refrain from taking an oath about which they are uncertain, but do not refrain from seizing property about which they are uncertain. And what is the reason for this? People reason that property can be returned if they turn out to be wrong, but an oath, a false oath, cannot be retracted. If it is proven that his seizure of the property was unjustified, the defendant can simply return it. By contrast, once he takes a false oath, there is no remedy for this situation. What he uttered was uttered. Therefore, one is more cautious when taking an oath than when seizing property. So bottom line, we are going to be quicker to suspect that somebody might be wrong, mistaken, or even misappropriating on purpose a deposit that he kept or a loan that he didn't repay. We're going to be quicker to suspect that than we are going to be to suspect that he would swear a false oath, because it's a higher level of culpability for the false oath. Now, Rabbi Zera raises a dilemma. If two people together had a garment in their grasp, right now we're back to the Mishna, number 1 here in chapter 1. If two people together had a garment in their grasp, and one of them seized it in its entirety from the grasp of the other in our presence, i.e. before the court, then what is the law? They came in, both holding the garment, and then once they were in our presence, the stronger one said, okay, and he just yanks it from the other one. Now, physically, he has complete possession of the garment, and the other one has no physical possession of the garment. But they walked in holding it together. So then what? So the Gemara asks, what are the circumstances? If the one from whom it was seized remained silent, so his silence indicates that he admits to the one who seized it from him that he is the owner. But if he shouted in protest when it was seized from his hand, well, what more should he have done? The fact that the other person is stronger than him is irrelevant as far as determining legal ownership of the garment, right? Might does not make right. But interesting that if when it was yanked away from him, if he, says, well, then that would seem to indicate that maybe he regrets coming to the court and getting involved in a litigation where he might have to swear an oath, and he's done because he really didn't have a claim to it. But if he objects when it's taken out of his hand, well, then that would indicate, no, it doesn't matter whether he's still holding it or not. His claim in his mind is, solid. He feels that he has ownership of this thing, and that's why he's here to litigate. Now, this idea that silence indicates that he concedes ownership, that's problematic. The Gemara explains it is necessary to raise this dilemma in a case where, when he was silent initially, when the other litigant seized the garment, and then he later shouted. He was silent when it was taken, but then later he said, hey, I do not relinquish possession of that. But he didn't do it right away. So then what? So do we read that as he's still holding on to his claim? Or do we read that as evidence that he doesn't really believe in his claim? What is the law? Is there an assumption that since he was initially silent, he admitted to the one who seized it from him that in seizing it, the litigant became the owner, and it was only later that he regretted doing so, and that's why he shouted later? Or perhaps, since he is shouting now about the injustice that was done to him, the matter is revealed that the fact that he was silent initially was simply because he thought, well, the rabbis of the court saw him grab it from me, so there is no need to cry out. Rav Nachman says, come and hear a solution to the dilemma from what was taught in a Baraisa. In what case is this statement said that both of them take an oath and each receives half the garment? It is said in a case where both of them are still holding the garment. But if the garment was in the possession of only one of them, then the burden of proof rests upon the claimant, i.e. the one who's not holding the garment, who now is the plaintiff, who wants to get the whole thing or at least half the thing from the other. He has the burden of proof because he no longer has possession, not even half possession. So in the absence of proof, the item remains in the possession of the one holding the garment. And the Gemara asks, what are the circumstances of this case? If we say that it is to be understood as it is taught, it is obvious that one who claims an item that is in somebody else's possession must bring proof to support his claim. That's the normal thing. If you are going to get into a litigation before a beis din, before a rabbinic court, to claim that somebody owes you money, guess what? You need to prove your claim. The burden is on you, the one trying to extract money. So rather, since that's obvious, this must be referring to a case where one of them seized it in our presence, which is the case to which Rabbi Zera referred. So since once they got in the room, once it, yanked it away, and he's like, okay, well, now I have all the physical possession, so let him prove that he found it. I don't have to prove anything. I'm holding the garment. But we know he just yanked it away by being stronger, more forceful, more chutzpahdik. That doesn't prove anything. It might indicate that, the tug of war before they entered the courtroom, it might pay. We haven't established this at all. I'm just speculating here. But it is true that possession is a strong part of the law in this situation. So if what happened was that two people were walking, they saw an object lying in the street, they both rushed toward it, right? And then they both grabbed it at the same time, and then one was able to yank it away, and now the other one brings him to court and says, hey, we found it at the same time. I'm entitled to half of it. Now, that's not the situation that our Mishna started with, where they walked into the courtroom both holding it. So that would be a different case. But let's see what we would learn about that case from this discussion. Now, the Gemara rejects this proof. No, it is possible that here we are dealing with a case where they came before us, the court, while both were holding the garment. So it's like Mishnah number 1 here. And then we, the court, said to them, go divide the garment. Right? You can either cut it in half or you can sell it and divide the proceeds. So that's the judgment of the court. So go do it. So then they left the court. And afterward they came back and one of them was holding the garment. And this one who is holding the garment says, once we went outside, the other one admitted to me that I was justified in my claim. And now the one who is not holding the garment said, yeah, I didn't give up my claim. What I said was, I will rent you my half of the garment. You can keep the whole thing, but you're going to have to pay me, since I own it, I co-own it with you, since we both found it at the same time. I'll let you be the one that uses it, but you have to pay me for that use. You have to rent my half of it. And that's what we agreed to, says the one who is not holding the garment. So in this case, that latter person's claim is not accepted. As we say to him, until now, you suspected him of being a robber, claiming that he took from you an item that you found. Remember, when they walked into the courtroom, both said, it's mine 100%. I found it and I own it 100%. That's the claim that both of them made. We sent them outside and said, go divide it. Then they come back and one of them has all of it and the other one says, okay, well, I let him rent my half of it. So now we're going to say to him, well, wait a minute. You previously said that you own all of it. Now you're saying you're renting to him half of it, your half. So what's going on here? Until now, you suspected him of being a robber who was claiming that he took from you an item that you found, and now you rented it to him without witnesses? Right? You're saying that he's a liar and you're the truth teller, and now you went and rented it to him without witnesses. Given that your claim is that he's a liar, why would you rent it to him in the absence of witnesses? You've weakened your case. You've weakened your position. Therefore, the burden of proof rests upon the one who is not holding the garment. And if you wish, say instead that it is possible to understand the case in the Baraisa as it is taught, i.e., they came before us while only one of them was holding the garment itself, but the other one was hanging on to the edge of the garment. And the Baraisa teaches that even according to Samachos, who says that in a case of property of uncertain ownership, the parties divide it without an oath. In this case, which is not what our Mishna said they have to take an oath that each owns no less than half. But according to Samachos, In this case, Sumakos would concede that hanging on to the edge is worth nothing, right? Both have to have a hold of it to make the claim that they own all of it or at least half of it. One who's just clinging to the edge, that's meaningless. Rabbi Zera's dilemma was not resolved, but the Gemara states a related law. If you say that if one seizes the garment in our presence, the court removes it from his possession, then if either of the parties consecrated the entire garment to the temple treasury, the consecration is not valid. Why? Because you cannot consecrate something that is not yours, right? Consecrate means you give it to the temple, right? You consecrate it to be given to charity, but specifically when the temple was standing, meant that you took something that was your property, your possession, and you made a pledge that you are giving it, right, to the temple treasury to be used for communal needs, for upkeep of the temple, etc. That means that it now becomes sacred property, and if you make any personal use of something that is consecrated, that's a transgression called misappropriation of sacred property. So the question here is, well, what did he consecrate? If it was not established as being his, maybe not even half of it was established as being his, then what did he consecrate, right? His consecration is meaningless. But if there's an uncertainty that he might have possession of half of it or all of it, and he consecrates it, well, then it becomes consecrated, right? And neither he nor the other guy can use something that is consecrated. So if you say that if one seizes the garment in our presence in the court, right, the two come in holding it and one yanks it in the presence of the court, then if either of the parties consecrated the entire garment to the temple treasury, the consecration is not valid as it is not his. But if you say that if one seizes the garment in our presence, the court does not remove it from his possession, then if one of them consecrated the entire garment to the temple treasury without seizing it, then what is the law? And the two sides of the dilemma are like this. Since the master said a principle with regard to the laws of transactions, that a declaration to the Most High is equivalent to a transfer to an ordinary person, i.e., if I say I'm giving you my jacket or I'm selling you my jacket, the jacket doesn't become yours until you pick up the jacket. Right? You make a kinyan, a formal act of acquisition on the jacket. But if I say this jacket, bli neder, right? Bli neder is what we say when we're just teaching and we don't mean to swear an oath. But if I say bli neder, this jacket is hereby consecrated. This jacket belongs to God. This jacket belongs to the Most High. This jacket is consecrated to the temple treasury. Then, God isn't going to swoop in and pick up the jacket. Nor does the temple treasurer have to arrive and pick up the jacket. As soon as I say it, it has been acquired by the Most High. Then in that situation, is the one who consecrated the garment therefore considered like one who seized it? And consequently, the consecration takes effect. I mean, it's funny, they're both holding it. And one says, I hereby consecrate this to the Most High. So was that like he yanked it away and consecrated it? Or is he consecrating his half? Or did nothing happen? What's going on? Or perhaps the consecration does not take effect, as now, in any event, he did not actually seize the garment and it is not his to consecrate. And it is written, Leviticus 27:14, and when a man shall sanctify his house to be sacred unto God, from which the sages derive, just as his house is in his possession, so too anything that one wishes to consecrate must be in his possession. Not just that he technically owns it, but it has to be in his possession, to the exclusion of this garment, which is not in his possession, as he did not actually seize it, and therefore the consecration does not take effect. So now the Gemara attempts to answer the question. Come and hear proof from an incident that transpired, as there was a certain bathhouse, now we're on page 6b, over which two people were arguing, and of which neither of them were in possession. Okay, so it's two businessmen. Let's say they co-owned a bathhouse and whatever. The finances had become complicated. And one of them says, well, we agreed, since we own several assets together, including a field and a bathhouse, that you're going to take the field and I'm going to take the bathhouse. And the other one says, no, what we agreed is the opposite. So they're arguing over who actually owns the bathhouse. And neither of them is actually in possession of the bathhouse, but one of them is the owner, and then they can't figure out what it is that they had agreed to. So this one said, it is mine, and that one said, it is mine. And one of them, in the midst of this controversy and this dispute over who actually owns it, one of them arose and consecrated the bathhouse. So Rav Hanania and Rav Oshaya and all the rabbis in that region kept away from the bathhouse, and they refrained from bathing there, lest they transgress the prohibition against misusing consecrated property, as they were uncertain whether this act of consecration in the midst of a dispute actually took effect or not. And Rav Oshaya said to Rabbah, when you go to study before Rav Chisda in the town of Kafre, ask him what we should do in this case. Excuse me, my neck is just stiff today. So when on his way to Kafre, Rabbah came to the city of Surah, and he related the incident to the sages there. And Rav Hamnuna said to him, the resolution to your dilemma is found in the following Mishna from Tractate Taharos 4:12. If there is uncertainty with regard to firstborns, whether a human firstborn or an animal firstborn. Okay, so a firstborn, right? So the firstborn male of a womb, right? So even a human. So if a woman's firstborn is a male, she's a Jewish family, right? And so, and so the firstborn, so the Jewish father, Jewish mother, and their firstborn of her womb is a male. So he has to redeem the firstborn, right? That's called the Pidyon Haben. And he has to give 5 coins to a Kohen, right? To a priest to redeem the firstborn. If the firstborn is a donkey, right? So again, firstborn male donkey of a female donkey's womb. If a female comes out first, you don't have to do this. But if it's a male firstborn of a donkey, you have to redeem it by giving a lamb to the temple. And if it's a sheep, or a cow or other firstborn, it's actually sacrificed in the temple unless it has a blemish. And there's all kinds of conditions about this. And I'll read a couple of those in a second. But the point that Rav Hamnuna said, right, because there's uncertainty. What we're uncertain is, was the firstborn a male or not? Right? Maybe the female gave birth to several offspring at the same time. And we're not sure which one came out first, because there was a female and a male in the litter, right? So then there's uncertainty. So if there is uncertainty with regard to firstborns, whether a human firstborn or an animal firstborn, whether regard to kosher animals or non-kosher animals, i.e. the firstborn of a donkey, so the burden of proof rests upon the claimant. Who's the claimant? Well, the priest receives an animal to take to the temple for sacrifice, or the priest receives an animal for his use, or the priest receives those 5 coins in the case of a human firstborn. So it's the priest acts as the claimant. So the priest may not take the animal from its owner or the redemption payment from the child's father because of the uncertainty. And it is taught in that regard in a baraisa that one is nevertheless prohibited from shearing and from working such animals, as their status as firstborns is uncertain. Because if they're consecrated as firstborns, then you wouldn't be allowed to work them. In the case of an ox, you couldn't use it to pull a wagon. In the case of a sheep, you couldn't shear it for its wool if it was indeed a firstborn and it was consecrated. Since we're uncertain, the priest can come and collect it, but the owner can't use it. Now, Rav Hamnuna continued, and here where the Mishnah effectively says that if a priest forcefully seized an animal whose status as a firstborn is uncertain, the court does not remove it from his possession. The priest stepped in and took it. Okay, but the priest might have been right. It's uncertain. The priest, if it turns out that it was the firstborn, then the priest is entitled to keep it. In the absence of a definitive proof, now that the priest has seized it, which he shouldn't have done, but now that he has done it, the court isn't going to step in and remove it from him. The court does not remove it from his possession, as it teaches that the burden of proof rests upon the claimant. So the Baraisa states that even when the priest did not seize it, one is prohibited from shearing and working it. So evidently the fact that the priest would remain in possession of the animal were he to seize it suffices to accord consecrated status to the animal, even in a case where the priest did not seize it. And the same is true in the case of the bathhouse, that even though the one who consecrated it had not taken possession of it, his consecration does take effect. Right? They were still disputing who owns the bathhouse, and it's unclear whether the one who consecrated it had the right to consecrate it. But he did. And so that's why, if it has been consecrated, now no one can use it because it would be misusing consecrated property. And that's why the rabbis didn't want to use it. So Rabbah said to Rav Hamnuna, whoa. This is no proof. You can't make a proof about our bathhouse situation from the law of the uncertain firstborn. Why? You say a ruling concerning the sanctity of a firstborn. Actually, I will say to you with regard to an animal whose status as a firstborn is uncertain, that if the priest seized it, the court does remove it from his possession, as there is no validity to ownership that is acquired by force. The priest had no right to take it. It is uncertain, and we will remove it from the priest. Accordingly, when the Mishnah states that the burden of proof rests upon the claimant, it means that the priest must bring proof that the animal is a firstborn. And nevertheless, one is prohibited from shearing and from working such an animal, as sanctity that emerges by itself is different. The sanctity of a firstborn does not result from somebody's act of consecration. Rather, the firstborn is consecrated by itself at birth. Therefore, the uncertainty with regard to its sanctity is intrinsic. And one is prohibited from using the animal as long as the uncertainty exists. By contrast, there was nothing inherently sacred about that bathhouse. It became possibly consecrated, possibly sacred, possibly off limits for personal use when one of the owners in their argument consecrated it, but he might not have had a right to consecrate it. There's nothing intrinsically sacred about the bathhouse. Rav Hanania said to Rabbah, a law is taught in a Baraisa that supports your opinion, that if a priest seizes an animal whose status as a firstborn is uncertain, that the court removes it from the priest's possession. The animals whose status as firstborn is uncertain enter the pen to be tithed. They are brought in together with the rest of the young animals from whom the animal tithe is separated. And this is so despite the fact that the laws of animal tithe do not apply to a firstborn animal. Right? When we're tithing animals, a shepherd, like somebody who owns a flock, what does he do? Each year, he takes all the newborns of that year and he puts them in a pen, and then he makes them pass one at a time under the rod, right? Passing under the rod to be counted. And tithing, right, comes from the Hebrew word le'aser, right? Like meiser is the way we normally would say it. But it's related to esrei or esrim, right? The 10th. It literally means the 10th. Tithing means the 10th. So 10 animals pass under the rod. The 10th animal is the tithe, right? That animal is going to have to be given as a tithe. And this uncertain firstborn, if it was an actual firstborn, it would not be counted with the other animals as part of the tithing because it's its own category of firstborn of a certain mother's womb. Now that it's uncertain, it is counted with the other ones. Now, if it enters your mind to say that in the case of an animal whose status as firstborn is uncertain, that is seized by a priest, that the court does not remove it from his possession, so why do these animals enter the pen? isn't this a case of the owner exempting his property from the animal tithe with the property of a priest? If the animal belongs to the priests, it cannot be used as a tithe, since one is obligated to separate the animal tithe from one's own animals, right? So surely if the animals go uncertain, firstborns go into the pen with the other ones, it must be that we do remove the animal from a priest if he were to seize it. So Abaye said to him, if your support for Rabba's opinion is due to that baraisa, it does not support the master. Here we are dealing with a case where the owner has only 9 animals, and the animal whose status as a firstborn is uncertain, right? So there's 9 animals and this uncertain one. So if the uncertain one doesn't go in the pen, there's going to be no tithe because we never got to the 10th. If it goes in with them, then there is going to be a tithe. Since whichever way you look at it, the owner of the animals is exempt. If that animal is not a firstborn, it belongs to the owner, and it is subject to the obligation to be tithed as part of the 10 animals, and the owner tithes properly. And if the animal is a firstborn, it belongs to the priests, and the animals are not subject to the obligation to be tithed, since the 9 animals belonging to an owner are not subject to tithing. So either way, one animal is going to go, and the other 9 are going to stay. Abaye then said, that which I said is not correct, as contrary to what I said, an animal whose status as firstborn is uncertain is not subject to tithing. As we learned in the Mishna, if before one completed tithing his animals, one of those already counted jumped back into the pen among the animals that were not yet counted, then all the animals in the pen are exempt from the obligation to be tithed, because each of them could be the animal that was already counted. And because animals are expensive, once there's an uncertainty of that kind, we're going to exempt all the animals that are uncertain, whether they have been counted already or not. We're going to exempt them from counting. And if it enters your mind that an animal whose status as a firstborn is uncertain, that it does require tithing, so let him tithe the remaining animals, as whichever way you look at it, his tithing would be effective. Because if this group of 10 emerging now renders the owner obligated in the animal tithe, so he's tithing properly. And if it does not render the owner obligated in the animal tithe, as one of the 10 is the animal that was previously counted and jumped back in the other side of the pen, nevertheless, each of the other 9 is exempt from animal tithe due to the principle of a tally fit to reach 10. What is the tally fit to reach 10? This principle is as Rava says, a tally fit to reach 10 exempts oneself from the obligation to tithe. Meaning, if one began counting animals for the purpose of tithing, and when he began the tally, the group was fit to be tithed, but ultimately he was unable to separate the tithe, for example, because one of the animals died, and now there were only 9 left. So those that were counted while the tally was fit to reach 10 are exempt from the requirement of animal tithe. They've already been counted. They're not going to be counted again. And the owner is not required to include them in the tithe the following year because, you only tithe from the newborns. And these have been counted, and so they're not going to be put back in the newborn pile the next year, even though we didn't have to tithe this year. And similarly, in a case where one of the 10 animals was already counted, the other 9 are nevertheless exempted by this count, as while he was counting them, the tally was fit to reach 10. Now we're going to just go ahead a little bit. We're on page 7a. Rather, what have you to say to explain why one is not required to tithe his flock in a case where a counted animal jumped back into the pen? The merciful one states, and all the tithe of the herd or the flock, anyone that passes under the rod, the 10th shall be sacred to the Lord, from which it is derived that a certain 10th animal must be tithed. A certain one, not a certain one, but you have to be certain that it is the 10th animal that is being tithed. But not an uncertain 10th, i.e. an animal that is not for sure the 10th. So here too, the entire flock is exempt from the tithe because the merciful one states that a certain 10th animal must be designated as a tithe and not an uncertain 10th, i.e. an animal that is not for sure subject to tithe. And therefore there is proof from the Baraisa that if a priest seizes an animal whose status as a firstborn is uncertain, the court removes it from his possession. So Rav Achav Difti said to Ravina, what are these animals of uncertain status that are subject to the tithe according to the Mishnah? If we say that the reference is to animals whose status as firstborns is uncertain, the merciful one states, the tenth shall be sacred to the Lord, indicating that the tithe animal becomes sacred only when it is designated as tithe, from which it is inferred, but not an animal that is already sacred for a different reason. Right? The firstborn is not counted among the other animals. Is an uncertain firstborn counted among the other animals? Seems like no. Therefore, since an animal whose status as a firstborn is uncertain is already considered sacred due to the uncertainty, we wouldn't shear it, we wouldn't work it, the sanctity of the animal tithe would not apply to it. We wouldn't include it in the count of other animals. Rather, the Mishnah must be referring to a case of an uncertain redemption of a firstborn donkey, i.e. the lamb used as a redemption for a donkey whose status as a firstborn is uncertain. And this is in accordance with the statement of Rav Nachman, as Rav Nachman says that Rabba bar Avu says an Israelite who has 10 donkeys, whose status as firstborn is uncertain in his home, separates 10 lambs to redeem them, and he tithes the lambs, separating one as a tithe, and they all belong to him, as a priest cannot prove that he is entitled to any of the 10. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. So the Gemara asks, what halakhic conclusion was reached about this matter of the bathhouse? So what do we do about that? Right? They were arguing. Neither one of them had clear possession, and he consecrated it. So what happened? So coming here, a conclusion, as Rabbi Chia bar Avin said, there was a similar incident that was brought before the school of Rav Chisda, and Rav Chisda brought the case before the school of Rav Huna, and Rav Huna resolved the issue based on that which Rav Nachman says. With regard to any property that one cannot recover from the possession of another party by legal process, if he consecrated it while it was in the possession of the other party, the consecration is not valid. And the Gemara questions Rav Nachman's statement by inference. Is it so that one cannot recover the property from the other party by legal process, and he consecrated it, that the consecration is valid, although he has not yet recovered it? But doesn't Rabbi Yochanan say, in a case where one robbed another of an item, and the owner did not despair retrieving it, neither the owner nor the robber can consecrate it. This one, the robber, because it is not his, and that one, the owner, because it is not in his possession. And the indication is that one cannot consecrate even his own item if it is not in his possession. And the Gemara answers, did you think that in the case of the bathhouse, we are dealing with a movable bath? No, we are dealing with a bath that is excavated in the ground, in which case once its owner can recover it by legal process, there is no need to take possession of it as it already exists in his possession. Okay, we'll stop there. We'll continue tomorrow, God willing, at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Tom, what if one or either of the two of the men is a priest? Are you talking about the bathhouse? Very interesting. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Can priests bathe in this consecrated bathhouse? I don't know. Because bathing, like a priest has to immerse in a mikvah before he can serve in the temple. Does he need to take a bath? Maybe. Maybe not. So in other words, if it's consecrated for the use of the priests so that they can serve in the temple, then maybe he could. But if it's really just, this bathhouse is meant to be given to the temple, what it would really mean is that then the temple would either, own and administrate the bathhouse and charge for it, or they would sell it and keep the proceeds for the temple. And with regard, and then Ifa, if one was an artist who had set the garment on the ground and sat afar to paint a picture of it, if the other found it, seizing all of it, would the partial painting be proof of ownership? What a good question. One could claim the artist created the painting of the garment after the other claimed it as found. Or if the artist left and returned after the other found and claimed it, could the artist use his picture as proof when bringing the case after the other felt secure in his claim? I mean, this is a great question. You're really thinking Talmudically. I don't know. Maybe this is the sort of thing where, when I was saying earlier that there needs to be some meat on the bone, right? We don't have the matter clearly established by the testimony of witnesses. we do have this circumstantial evidence that would certainly conform to the story of the one who claims he's an artist and was painting it. But as you say, there would be a counter argument that, renders the painting meaningless. So it would just be something that the sages would take into account. The question, I guess, would be is, could we say that this is really a case of two holding the garment, even though only one is holding the garment, right? That would be a great question. I'm not sure what the answer is. That's it for